Hi, welcome to Chapter 3. This is Miss Lewison and we're ready to get started. This is the first video for Chapter 3, and so we're going to talk about energy and where we are with energy and how it moves through the system. First, some definitions you should be familiar with. Ecosystem, it's basically an area, and it includes both your biotic and abiotic components. Of course, biotic is living and abiotic is non-living. So all your organisms, your animals, your plants, your bacteria are biotic, and then your abiotic are such things as water, soil, air, rocks, that kind of thing. All the non-living, not made of cells. Okay, a couple more vocabulary terms for you. Ecosystem boundaries. Very few ecosystems have distinct boundaries. Most of them flow right into the next ecosystem. Things like lakes, the ocean, caves have a more distinct boundaries, but most things like forests, they flow right into the next area, the grasslands or the meadows and that kind of stuff. Ecotone is the transition between two ecosystems. So going from the forest to the grasslands. Ecotone areas have a very, very high biodiversity because they will have both organisms from both areas. So they are very, very important areas. Okay, so talking about energy in ecosystems, we have to talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Your producers or autotrophs are the ones who are going to be carrying on photosynthesis, and then all organisms, producers, consumers, autotrophs, heterotrophs, all organisms carry on cellular respiration. You need to be familiar with the formula, which is of course here. So we have the formula here. CO2, H2O, gives you sugar. This is C6H12O6, also known as glucose or sugar. And then it releases oxygen. To balance this is not a balanced equation. If we were going to balance this, you would put a 6 in front of the CO2, a 6 in front of the H2O, and a 6 in front of the O2, and then it's a balanced equation. You have to know this formula. CO2 is coming from the atmosphere. It's a very important way. CO2 is removed from our atmosphere, and of course plants are obtaining water from the soil, and then they're making the glucose and the oxygen. Must know the formula. Okay. Cellular respiration is used by all organisms to convert glucose into usable energy. So to go back real quick, the one thing that's not on here that's on here that, the plants getting their energy from the sun, this is solar energy, and they're converting it into chemical energy. Okay, so that's important to note, that this is a conversion of energy. So in cellular respiration, we're taking that energy back out. Now it's in a chemical form. Now we're going to need to move it more into a kinetic form so we can actually use that energy. And if you look at the equation, you should notice that it's exactly the opposite of cellular respiration. Photosynthesis. So now we have the glucose. That is our chemical energy. We add oxygen. Yes, we breathe to or respire to obtain oxygen. And we release energy. Sorry, getting used to writing on slides. This is a new thing for me. Okay, so we're releasing energy, and then we breathe out CO2 and H2O. And that's why you can see your breath on some days. So again, cellular respiration and photosynthesis, the equations are just opposite. In photosynthesis, this energy is being added through solar energy and made into chemical energy. And in cellular respiration, that chemical energy in the glucose molecule is being released into usable energy. Okay, so this is occurring in our food webs and our food chains. And we have different levels we refer to as trophic levels in these areas. You have consumers. Consumers are organisms that, of course, obtain their energy by consuming other animals. The first one is your herbivores. They are eating the producers. We also know We also call them primary consumers because they're consuming the producers. The secondary consumers consume the primary consumers and are usually carnivores or omnivores. And then your tertiary consumers are eating your secondary consumers, and so on. And you can go up the web. Most times, the food web in a terrestrial ecosystem is quite short. Because it takes so much energy, you can't have long ones because there's just not enough room, if that makes sense. So here's an example of two terrestrial and an aquatic food web. You have your organisms here. Here's your producer who is doing, this is giving me problems. Okay, so there's your producer. It's eaten, in this case, by your herbivore, your primary consumer, who is eaten by your secondary consumer. Arrows always follow the flow of energy. So they go from who's being eaten to who's doing the eating. Okay, so they always flow. Don't say up or down, because I can turn this food web upside down. I can do that. They follow the flow of energy. Okay. Food chains is just a sequence like before. Food webs are more complicated, but even this, after you do the activity on food webs for the class, you'll notice that this is a very simplified food web. This is not complicated at all. Food webs are actually very, very complicated. Any food web you see is actually simplified to some degree because this is very complicated within an ecosystem. The more complicated it is, the better, because it makes the environment more stable, and that means that the organisms in the area are less likely to have issues if for some reason an organism is removed from the area. So its predator won't have negative consequences because there's lots of choices. Okay, some vocabulary you should know. Herbivores eat producers. They're plant eaters. Carnivores eat consumers. They're meat eaters. Omnivores can eat either producers or consumers, so they can eat meat or plants, and so they can occupy several different trophic levels depending on the food chain you are looking at. We are that way. If you had a salad for lunch, then you are a producer, or you ate a producer. But if you had chicken or hamburger, then you ate meat, and you are a consumer. And if your chicken was fed worms, then you could be even a tertiary consumer. So, scavengers eat dead animals. You're thinking vultures and those kind of things that come along. Detritivores specialize in breaking down dead tissues and stuff like that. Think of like dung beetles, things like that. And then your decomposers are your fungus and bacteria, and they actually consume their food. They do not produce food. So be very careful. These are not producers. Fungus cannot be a producer. It does not do photosynthesis. So be very careful there. Okay, moving on to productivity. Productivity is something we have not talked about in class, and you are going to be doing a lab on this, aquatic primary productivity lab. So you will get this when you do this. Gross primary productivity is actually just a measure of the amount of photosynthesis occurring by your plant or in the ecosystem. We cannot measure gross primary productivity directly. There's no way to do that because your plants are also doing cellular respiration. Net primary productivity is the energy from your gross primary productivity that is turned into biomass. So we can measure that. We can measure weight increase or biomass increase in an organism to determine their net primary productivity. We can also measure that indirectly by the amount of oxygen that is produced. since oxygen is being produced in photosynthesis and a little bit's being used in cellular respiration, your net gain in oxygen would be also a measurement of your net primary productivity. And then you have cellular respiration, which is going on in all animals. So ultimately, we come up with the equation NPP equals GPP minus R. So net primary productivity equals gross primary productivity minus respiration. So if I know net primary productivity, and I can measure or figure out what my respiration is, then I can figure out what my gross primary productivity is. And that is what you will be doing in the primary productivity lab. So we will go over this more for that lab. Okay, so looking at the diagram here from your book, 99% of the solar energy hitting our planet is actually lost. It's absorbed and stuff like that, but it is not used for photosynthesis. Only about 1% of the solar energy striking our planet is used for photosynthesis. Then about 60% of that is lost due to respiration. So only about 40% of 1% is ultimately producing our NPP, our net primary productivity. So that's our biomass. So 0.4% of the solar energy is all that is used to make our entire food web on the entire planet. So as you can see, the sun is producing a whole lot of energy because even just a small fraction is plenty to feed our population. Okay, one last thing before I call this is let's look at trophic pyramids and energy efficiency. Ecological efficiency is basically the rate at which energy is passed from one level in a trophic pyramid to the next, or from one trophic level to another. So producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer. The range, depending on the organism, is somewhere between 4 and 40%. That is the range. We consider the average to be about 10%. So this is the 10% rule. So about 10% of energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. So in this diagram, you will see that there is basically 10% of the energy here is transferred to the next right. And then 10% of that energy goes up to the lion. So 10,000 joules of energy for producers equals only about 100 joules of energy for your top carnivores. So that's a huge loss of energy. 90% of energy is lost. That is huge, and therefore is a very concern. And one of the reasons our food chains are not very long in the terrestrial environment, because we just don't have the space to produce all that energy by the producers. Our space is limited. So the number of producers are limited, and therefore our food chains are limited. It's much more efficient to eat at the bottom of the food chain. Okay, one last thing. Biomass, and then this PowerPoint will be over, and then we can go on to part 2. Pyramids, 3 types: biomass, numbers, and productivity. Numbers is just straight numbers. Biomass is the amount of biomass at a given moment in time. Productivity is over a period of time, how much photosynthesis and biomass is increasing. So for numbers, you can have inversion. You can have situations where you have a little bar under a bigger bar because it does not take size into consideration. So one large tree can have lots and lots of little tiny aphids living on it. So because it's straight numbers, it can be inverted. Also, biomass can be inverted because it's a moment in time. So in this case, your phytoplankton is smaller than your zooplankton. That's because this is probably done in the fall, where productivity for photosynthesis is tapering off because the light amount is decreasing, and the energy has moved up here, but there's still energy here, so this has not been affected yet. Eventually, these will all shrink, but as of yet, they have not. So it's because it's a moment in time. And lastly, is your energy. Energy is always, always, always a true pyramid because, again, it's the 10% rule. So if only 10% of your energy is moving from one trophic level to the next, then everyone has to get smaller and smaller because you can't get more energy from nowhere. Okay, we're going to cut that off. Have a great evening, and I will talk to you soon.